Chapter 11. The next few hours were the worst of Phil's life. First and foremost was his mother. As soon as she walked in, Phil's priorities changed from wanting her to comfort him to wanting to comfort her. And of course, there wasn't any comfort. All he could do was hold on to her. It's too cruel, he thought dimly. There ought to be a way to tell her, but she would never believe it. And if she did, she'd be in danger too. Eventually the paramedics did come, but only after Dr. Franklin had arrived. I called him, James said to Phil during one of the interludes when Phil's mum was crying on Cliff. Why? To keep things simple. In this state, doctors can issue a death certificate if they've seen you within the last 20 days and they know the cause of death. We don't want any hospitals or coroners. Phil shook his head. Why? What's your problem with hospitals? My problem, James said in a clipped, distinct voice, is that in hospitals they do autopsies. Phil froze. He opened his mouth but no sound came out. And in funeral homes they do embalming, which is why I need to be around when they come to pick up the body. I need to influence their minds not to embalm her, or sew her lips shut, or Phil bolted for the bathroom and was sick. He hated James again. But nobody took Poppy to the hospital, and Dr. Franklin didn't mention an autopsy. He just held Phil's mother's hands and spoke quietly about how these things can happen suddenly, and how at least Poppy had been spared any pain. But she was so much better today, Phil's mother whispered through tears. Oh, my baby, she's been getting worse, but today she was better. It happens like that sometimes, Dr. Franklin said. It's almost as if they rally for a last burst of life. But I wasn't there for her, Phil's mum said, and now there weren't any tears, just the terrible grating sound of guilt. She was alone when she died. Phil said, she was asleep. She just went to sleep and never woke up. If you look at her, you can see how peaceful it was. He kept saying things like that, and so did Cliff, and so did the doctor, and eventually the paramedics went away. And sometime after that, while his mother was sitting on Poppy's bed and stroking her hair, the people from the mortuary came. Just give me a few minutes, Phil's mother said, dry-eyed and pale. I need a few minutes alone with her. The mortuary men sat awkwardly in the family room, and James stared at them. Phil knew what was going on. James was fixing in their minds the fact that there was to be no embalming. Religious reasons, is that it? One of the men said to Cliff, breaking a long silence. Cliff stared at him, eyebrows coming together. What are you talking about? The man nodded. I understand. It's no problem. Phil understood too. Whatever the man was hearing, it wasn't what Cliff was saying. The only thing is, you'll want to have the viewing right away, the other man said to Cliff, or else a closed casket. Yes, it was unexpected, Cliff said, his face straightening out. It's been a very short illness. So now he wasn't hearing what the men were saying. Phil looked at James and saw sweat trickling down his face. Clearly it was a struggle to control three minds at once. At last, Cliff went in and got Phil's mother. He led her to the master bedroom to keep her from seeing what would happen next. What happened was that the two men went into Poppy's room with a body bag and a gurney. When they came out, there was a small, delicate hump in the bag. Phil felt himself losing rationality again. He wanted to knock things down. He wanted to run a marathon to get away. Instead, his knees started to buckle and his vision greyed out. Hard arms held him up and led him to a chair. Hang on, James said. Just a few more minutes. It's almost over. Right then, Phil could almost forgive him for being a blood-sucking monster. It was very late that night when everyone finally went to bed. To bed, not to sleep. Phil was one solid ache of misery from his throat down to his feet, and he lay awake with the light on until the sun came up. The funeral home was like a Victorian mansion, and the room Poppy was in was filled with flowers and people. Poppy herself was in a white casket with gold fittings, and from far away she looked as if she were sleeping. Phil didn't like to look at her. He looked instead at the visitors who kept coming in and filling the viewing room and the dozens of wooden pews. He'd never realised how many people loved Poppy. She was so full of life, her English teacher said. I can't believe she's gone, a guy from Phil's football team said. I'll never forget her, one of her friends said, crying. Phil wore a dark suit and stood with his mother and Cliff. It was like a receiving line for a wedding. His mother kept saying, "Thank you for coming," and hugging people. The people went over and touched the casket gently and cried. And in the process of greeting so many mourners, something strange happened. Phil got drawn in. And the reality of Poppy's death was so real that all the vampire stuff began to seem like a dream. Bit by bit, he started to believe the story he was acting out. After all, everybody was so sure Poppy had gotten cancer, and now she was dead. Vampires were just superstition. James didn't come to the viewing. Poppy was dreaming. She was walking by the ocean with James. It was warm, and she could smell salt, and her feet were wet and sandy. She was wearing a new bathing suit, the kind that changes colour when it gets wet. She hoped James would notice the suit, but he didn't say anything about it. Then she realised he was wearing a mask. That was strange, because he was going to get a very weird tan with most of his face covered up. Shouldn't you take that off? She said, thinking he might need help. I wear it for my health, James said, and it wasn't James's voice. Poppy was shocked. She reached out and pulled the mask away. It wasn't James. It was a boy with ash blonde hair, even lighter than Phil's. Why hadn't she noticed his hair earlier? His eyes were green, and then they were blue. Who are you? Poppy demanded. She was afraid. That would be telling. He smiled. His eyes were violet. Then he lifted his hand, and she saw that he was holding a poppy. At least, it was shaped like a poppy, but it was black. He caressed her cheek with the flower. Just remember, he said, smiling whimsically, bad magic happens. What? Bad magic happens, he said, and turned and walked away. She found herself holding the poppy. He didn't leave any footprints in the sand. Poppy was alone, and the ocean was roaring. Clouds were gathering overhead. She wanted to wake up now, but she couldn't, and she was alone and scared. She dropped the flower as anguish surged through her. James! Phil sat up in bed, heart pounding. God, what had that been? Something like a shout, in Poppy's voice. I'm hallucinating. Which wasn't surprising. It was Monday, the day after Poppy's funeral. Phil glanced at the clock. About 4 hours he had to be at the church. No wonder he was dreaming about her. But she had sounded so scared. Phil put the thought out of his mind. It wasn't even hard. He'd convinced himself that Poppy was dead, and dead people didn't shout. At the funeral, though, Phil got a shock. His father was there. He was even wearing something resembling a suit, although the jacket didn't match the trousers and his tie was askew.